Why this conflict? Why does the animosity between the children of the star and the children of the crescent, between the people we call the Jews and the Arabs, burn with a fire that centuries cannot quench? To find the answer, we must not look at today's headlines, but at the heart of a story that began 4,000 years ago. It is not a story of nations, but of a family. It is not a conflict over politics, but over a promise. And it all begins with one man, standing under a canopy of stars, listening to the voice of God. His name was Abraham, and he was the lord of the sun-scorched barrens, a vast and unforgiving kingdom of rock and sand. He was a man of immense wealth and power, his caravans crisscrossing the deserts, his authority unquestioned. Yet his kingdom was a paradox, a dominion of the dying, a land without a future. For the one thing Abraham desired more than anything, the one thing that would give his life meaning, was the one thing he did not have, an heir. Years before, a voice as powerful as the thunder and as intimate as a whisper had come to him. It was the voice of the one true God, and it had made him a covenant, a promise of impossible grandeur. It promised him a son, and through that son a lineage as numerous as the stars in the night sky. And it promised him a land not the barren wastes he currently ruled, but a legendary, almost mythical place, the Valley of Living Water, a paradise of green pastures and flowing rivers that would be an inheritance for his descendants forever. This promise became the sun around which Abraham's life revolved. Every morning he would climb the highest tower of his stone fortress and gaze eastward towards the shimmering horizon where he believed the valley lay hidden. He was a man defined by faith, a king who staked his entire existence on a divine word. But there was another soul in that fortress, one for whom the promise was not a source of hope, but of ever-deepening pain. Her name was Sarah, Abraham's wife, the matriarch of their great house. She too had heard the promise. She too had dreamed of the laughter of a child echoing through the stone halls. But the years had passed like grains of sand through her fingers, and her womb remained as barren as the lands outside their walls. Each month, the moon would wax and wane, a silent silver mockery of her body's failure. She saw the pity in the eyes of her handmaidens and heard the whispers that followed her through the courtyards. She was the lady of a great house with no one to pass it to, a queen with no prince. The promise, once a beautiful melody, had become a dissonant chord of shame and despair that played endlessly in her heart. The silence of an empty cradle was the loudest sound in her world. One evening, as the desert air grew cool, Sarah approached her husband. The lines of grief were carved deep into her face, but her eyes held a new, desperate resolve. "My Lord Abraham," she began, her voice brittle, "the voice of God has been clear. It has promised you a legacy. It has promised your name will endure. But the years have proven that it will not be through me. The Lord has closed my womb." Abraham began to protest, to offer words of comfort and faith, but she raised a hand to stop him. "I can no longer be the vessel of our ruin," she said, her voice cracking. "There is another way, a way of men, when the way of God seems delayed." She then spoke the name that would change the course of history. "Hagar," she said. "Hagar of the riverlands, her most loyal and beautiful handmaiden." She was a foreigner, a woman from the lush green lands of the south, brought to the barrens as part of a treaty. She was dutiful, strong, and fertile. "Go to her," Sarah pleaded, the words tearing from her throat. "Lie with her. Perhaps through her I can build a family. Let her son be your son. Let his life fulfill the promise that my body cannot." The proposal was a dagger in Abraham's heart. It was a plan born of human desperation, a shortcut around the long, arduous path of faith. He looked at his wife, at the profound suffering in her eyes, and his own faith wavered. How long could he ask her to endure this shame? How long could he himself wait for a miracle that refused to arrive? The logic of the plan was simple, practical, and devastating. It was a concession to reality, an admission that perhaps they had misunderstood, or that God needed their help to fulfill his own word. That night, a heavy silence fell over the fortress. The decision was made. It was a choice born not of malice but of brokenness, not of ambition but of agonizing love and unbearable sorrow. As Abraham walked down the torchlit corridor toward Hagar's chambers, he was not a triumphant king securing his dynasty. He was a man of faltering faith, taking a step into a shadow of his own making, unaware that its consequences would stretch across millennia. giving birth to a rivalry that would one day bleed across the very lands he was promised. The first seed of conflict was not planted in a field of battle, but in a bed of sorrow. Hagar of the Riverlands had always known her place. She was a shadow that followed the light of her mistress, a loyal servant in a foreign land. But on that fateful night, as she lay in the chambers of the Lord of the Barons, she was no longer a shadow. She was the vessel of a kingdom's hope, the instrument of a desperate plan. There was no passion in the act, only the heavy weight of duty, the scent of fear, and the profound, silent sorrow of two women, the one who gave the order and the one who obeyed. Weeks turned into months, and a change began, not just in Hagar's body, but in her very soul. The first sign was a subtle straightening of her back as she walked the stone corridors. The second was a new fire in her eyes, a glimmer of something that was not subservience. She was carrying the future. She was carrying the son of Abraham, the heir to the promise. The child within her was not just a life, it was leverage, it was power, and Sarah saw it all. The plan she had devised in her desperation had become a poisoned chalice. She had hoped for a son by proxy, a child she could claim as her own. Instead, every day she was forced to witness the living, growing symbol of her own failure. Hagar's swelling belly was a constant, mocking testament to her own barrenness. The pride she saw in her handmaiden's eyes felt like a personal betrayal. The very woman she had raised up now seemed to look down on her with contempt. The fortress, once a home, became a theater of silent warfare, a dropped cup, a delayed response. A glance held a moment too long. Each was a skirmish in an undeclared war. The air grew thick with a tension only the women could feel. Sarah's grief, once a quiet ache, curdled into a vicious, bitter resentment. Her words became sharp, her commands harsh. She sought to remind Hagar of her place, to put the servant back in the box from which she had emerged. Hagar, for her part, endured it at first, but the mother in her was rising, fierce and protective. This was not just about her anymore. It was about the Lord growing within her. How could the mother of a future king be treated as the lowest of slaves? Her humility began to fray, replaced by a defiant pride. She was no longer just Hagar of the Riverlands. She was the mother of the heir. Abraham, the great Lord, was lost between them. He was a lion caught in a net woven by the two women he cared for. He saw the cruelty in Sarah's eyes and the defiance in Hagar's. He had sanctioned this path, and now he was powerless to control the firestorm it had unleashed within the walls of his own home. His kingdom was finally promised a future, but his household was being torn apart in the present. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon. Sarah, in a fit of rage and jealousy, struck Hagar, her words a torrent of venom, reminding her that she was nothing but a slave, her child nothing but the product of a borrowed womb. That was the final blow. Hagar could no longer breathe the poisoned air of the fortress. That night, under the cloak of darkness, she fled. With only a small satchel of water and bread, she ran out into the vast, terrifying emptiness of the sun-scorched barrens. She ran not towards a destination, but away from the torment, choosing the mercy of the unforgiving desert over the cruelty of her mistress. She walked for days, her hope draining away with her water supply. Finally, she collapsed beside a meager spring, a pitiful trickle of life in a world of death. She was alone, pregnant, and utterly hopeless. She wept for her lost home in the Riverlands, for the life she once had, and for the unborn son who was now condemned to die with her in this wasteland. It was there, at the very edge of despair, that the voice found her. It was not the thunderous voice that had spoken to Abraham from the mountaintops, but a presence, a gentle yet powerful whisper in the shimmering heat. An emissary of light stood before her. "Hagar," the emissary said, and the sound of her name was like cool water on her parched soul. "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" Sobbing, she told him her story. She was fleeing from the face of her mistress Sarah. The emissary listened, his gaze filled not with judgment, but with a profound understanding. "Return to your mistress," he commanded gently, "and submit to her authority. For I have heard your affliction, and your descendants will be too numerous to count." Then he leaned closer and gave her a promise and a prophecy. "You will bear a son," he said, his voice resonating with the weight of destiny. "You shall name him Ishmael, for God has heard. He will be a man of the untamed wilds, his spirit as fierce and free as the desert wind. His hand will be raised against his kinsmen, and their hands will be raised against him. And he will live in defiance of all his brothers, a wild man, a life of conflict. Living in defiance of his brothers. It was a hard destiny, a fate of struggle and strife, and yet it was also a promise of greatness. Her son would not be a forgotten footnote. He would be the patriarch of a mighty and untamable people. He too had a destiny. Hagar lifted her head, the tears gone from her eyes, replaced by the same fire that Sarah had so feared. But this was a different fire, one kindled not by pride but by a divine encounter. She was no longer a runaway slave. She was a woman with a mission, the mother of Ishmael, the carrier of a divine prophecy. She returned to the fortress of Abraham. When she walked through the gates, she was not the same woman who had fled. She walked with her head held high, her gaze steady. She submitted to Sarah as commanded, but the submission was different now. It was the submission of one who knew her own worth and her son's destiny. And so, an uneasy truce settled over the great house. Ishmael was born, a strong and beautiful boy, the image of his father. Abraham loved him with all his heart. But the house was now divided. It contained two women, two promises, and two competing destinies, all living under one roof. The conflict had not been resolved, it had simply been given a name, and everyone was waiting, knowingly or not, for the event that would ignite the simmering war once more. 14 years passed. The sun-scorched barrens had an heir. Ishmael grew from a boy into a young man, and the prophecy surrounding him began to take shape. He was everything the emissary had foretold, wild, untamable, his spirit belonging more to the shifting dunes and rocky crags than to the cold stone of the fortress. He was a master of the bow and the javelin, his laughter echoing through the canyons as he hunted the desert lions. Abraham, seeing the strength and vitality of his son, adored him. In Ishmael, he saw the fulfillment of the promise, the future of his lineage secured. The ache for another son, the one promised so long ago, had softened into a distant memory. He had made his choice, and God, it seemed, had blessed it. Sarah watched from the shadows of the fortress, her heart a tapestry of conflicting emotions. She had learned to live with the arrangement, to accept Ishmael as the heir. She treated him with a detached kindness, the way one might treat a ward, a necessary piece of the household puzzle. Yet she could never bring herself to truly love him. Every time she looked at him, she saw the face of Hagar, a living monument to her own barrenness and the desperate failed plan she had conceived. Her own promise, the one whispered to her by Abraham under the starlight, felt like a forgotten dream. She had aged. Her hair was now a river of silver, the lines of time etched deeply around her eyes. She was a woman who had made her peace with the quiet tragedy of an unanswered prayer. The kingdom, too, had settled. The caravans came and went. The storerooms were full, and the name of Abraham was respected throughout the lands. The crisis of succession was over. An heir lived and breathed. It was on an ordinary day, during the suffocating heat of noon, that everything changed. 3 strangers appeared at the edge of the desert, walking towards the fortress as if they were expected. They were not merchants or messengers. They moved with an otherworldly grace, their robes unstained by the dust of the road. Abraham, a master of desert hospitality, ran to greet them, bowing low and offering them water, rest, and the best food his household could provide. He did not know he was entertaining angels. As they sat in the shade of the great terebinth tree outside his tent, one of the visitors looked directly at Abraham. His eyes were ancient, holding the light of stars not yet born. "I will surely return to you about this time next year," the stranger said. His voice calm, yet carrying an undeniable authority. "And Sarah, your wife, will have a son." Inside the tent, just behind the flap, Sarah was listening. A sound escaped her lips, a sound she had not made in decades. It was a laugh, but it was not a laugh of joy. It was a dry, bitter, cynical laugh, born of a hope so long dead it had turned to dust. A son? Her? A woman whose body had long since withered, whose time for childbearing was a distant memory. The idea was so preposterous, so absurdly cruel, it was laughable. It was a joke at the expense of her lifelong sorrow. The visitor's head turned slightly, his gaze seeming to pierce the tent fabric. "Why did Sarah laugh?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "Why did she say, 'Shall I, a woman so old, really bear a child? Is anything too hard for the Lord?'" A cold fear gripped Sarah's heart. He had heard her. He had heard the silent, scornful thought in her mind. She stumbled out of the tent, her face pale. "I did not laugh," she lied, her voice trembling. "No," the visitor replied. His eyes filled not with condemnation but with a deep, knowing compassion. But you did laugh. After the visitors departed, leaving behind an aura of awe and terror, their words hung in the air, reigniting a spark in the deepest, most forgotten part of Sarah's soul. A son, her son. The absurdity of it warred with the divine power she had just witnessed. For the first time in years, a fragile, terrifying hope began to bloom in the barren desert of her heart. And then, the miracle happened. It did not come with a clap of thunder or a sign in the heavens. It came quietly, secretly, within the sacred space of her own body. A change began that defied all laws of nature and time. Life, impossible and undeniable, began to stir within her. The Lord had remembered his promise. He had bypassed the desperate plans of men and intervened with the irrefutable power of his own will. When the time came, the fortress that had only known the cries of one son now heard another. Sarah, the barren one, the woman who had laughed in disbelief, held her own child in her arms. Abraham wept with a joy so profound it shook his entire being. They looked at the baby's face, a perfect blend of their own, and they knew what he must be called. Isaac. His name meant laughter. Not the bitter, cynical laughter of doubt, but the pure, unadulterated laughter of joyous disbelief. The laughter of a miracle. He was the child of the promise, born not of human striving but of divine intervention. His very existence was a testament that God's plan could not be rushed, nor could it be thwarted. The birth of Isaac was a moment of supreme joy, but it was also the tremor that signaled a coming earthquake. The fragile peace of the household was shattered. Now there were not just two women and two destinies. Now there were two sons, one born of a slave, a product of human desperation. The other born of the free woman, a child of a divine promise. One was the son of the flesh, the other the son of the spirit. And in a kingdom that could only have one heir, in a land that could only be given to one lineage, the birth of the Son of Laughter set the stage for a conflict that would bring forth tears of blood for generations to come. The rivalry was no longer just between two women in a tent. It was now between two brothers in the field, a clash of destinies that would shape the future of the world. The day Isaac was weaned was a day of monumental celebration in the kingdom of the sun-scorched barrens. It was a formal declaration, a public rite of passage. It signified that the child had survived the perilous first years of life and was now firmly established, a healthy and thriving heir. Abraham, his heart overflowing, ordered a great feast. The fortress buzzed with activity. Herdsmen brought forth the finest lambs for the roasting pits. Servants carried out enormous platters of dates, figs, and honey cakes, and the cellars were opened to provide the best wine. It was a feast to honor the Son of Laughter, the child of the miracle. Abraham, holding Isaac aloft for all to see, was the picture of a fulfilled patriarch. His face, weathered by 100 years of sun and wind, shone with a light that seemed to erase the decades. This was the moment he had waited for his entire life. This was the true heir, the living embodiment of God's impossible promise. But not all eyes looked upon the scene with joy. From the edge of the courtyard, another pair of eyes watched, cold and hard as desert flint. Ishmael, now a strapping young man of 17, stood with his arms crossed. He was no longer a child. He was a hunter, a warrior, his shoulders broad and his hands calloused from the grip of a bow. For 14 years he had been the undisputed heir. He was the firstborn, the son who had brought his father comfort and pride when all hope was lost. He was the one who had learned the ways of the kingdom, who knew the paths of the caravans and the secret wells in the desert. The kingdom was to have been his. Now, he watched this celebration for a toddler, a weak, crying thing who had been born of a withered old woman. He saw the way his father doted on the child, the way the entire household fawned over this late-born usurper. The feast felt like a personal insult. Every cheer for Isaac was a jeer against him. The laughter that gave the new child his name now sounded like a mockery of his own existence. The bitterness that had been a quiet stream within him for 3 years began to swell into a raging river of resentment. He saw Isaac stumbling around the courtyard on his unsteady toddler legs, and a sneer twisted his lips. It was then that Sarah saw him. Her eyes, sharpened by a mother's protective instinct, missed nothing. She saw Ishmael approach his little half-brother, but he was not playing. His movements were predatory, his smile a cruel imitation of affection. He began to play with Isaac, but it was the play of a hawk with a sparrow. He was mocking him. He made exaggerated, foolish faces, mimicking the child's gurgling sounds with derisive scorn. He would push him, just a little too hard, disguised as a game, and laugh when the toddler fell. To anyone else, it might have looked like rough, harmless sibling teasing, but Sarah saw it for what it was. It was a display of dominance. It was contempt. It was the acting out of the prophecy spoken over Ishmael years ago. His hand will be raised against his kinsman. In that moment, Sarah saw the future, a terrifying vision of her precious, gentle Isaac at the mercy of this wild, resentful young man. She saw the son of the slave woman mocking the son of the free woman, asserting his perceived superiority as the firstborn, the stronger one. A cold, primal fear seized her, instantly crystallizing into an iron resolve. This could not stand. The two could not coexist. The house was not big enough for both of them, for both of their destinies. The wolf and the lamb could not share the same pen. She marched directly to Abraham. The sounds of the feast faded into a dull roar in her ears. Her face was a mask of fury. "Get rid of them," she commanded, her voice low and trembling with intensity. "This slave woman and her son. Send them away." Abraham stared at her, the joyous expression falling from his face. Send them away? Hagar? My son, Ishmael? The idea was abhorrent to him. He loved Ishmael. The boy was his own flesh and blood, his firstborn. He had raised him, taught him, celebrated his strengths. To cast him out was unthinkable, a violation of every principle of fatherhood and kinship. "He will not be heir with my son." Sarah's voice rose, cutting through the festive air. "That boy, the son of that slave, will not share in the inheritance with my son, with Isaac. I will not have it. I will not have my son live in the shadow of his mockery, in fear of his hand." The words struck Abraham like a physical blow. He was torn in two. On one side was his love for his firstborn son. On the other was the fierce, undeniable truth in Sarah's words, and the divine nature of Isaac's birth. He turned away, his heart in agony. He spent the night in torment, walking the battlements of his fortress, pleading with God. How could he ask this of him? To tear his own family apart? To cast out his own son into the wilderness? Then, in the deep silence of the pre-dawn hours, the voice he knew so well spoke to his heart. It was not a voice of anger, but of solemn direction. "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman," the voice said, its tone both comforting and firm. "Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a great nation also, because he is your offspring." The words were both a comfort and a death sentence. God was confirming Sarah's demand. The separation was necessary. It was his will. He promised to care for Ishmael, to give him his own destiny, his own greatness. But the covenant, the inheritance, the valley of living water that belonged to Isaac alone, the line had to be drawn, clean and absolute. The decision was made. As the first rays of sun crested the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the courtyard, Abraham's heart broke. He knew what he had to do. The feast was over. Now came the famine. The son of laughter had secured his place, but the cost would be the expulsion of his brother, an act of separation that would echo through eternity, creating a chasm between two peoples that would never be bridged. The morning broke, cold and grey, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the day's grim task. The joyous remnants of the feast-wilted garlands and overturned wine goblets lay, scattered across the courtyard like debris after a battle. Abraham moved like a man in a dream, his steps heavy with the weight of a divine yet soul-crushing command. He found Hagar and Ishmael at the edge of the servants' quarters. They knew something was wrong. The air was thick with a finality that needed no words. Ishmael, the proud hunter, stood tall and defiant, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his eyes burning with a mixture of anger and confusion. Hagar simply watched Abraham, her face a stoic mask that could not quite hide the terror in her eyes. She had been here before, cast out by Sarah's jealousy, but this time was different. This time it felt permanent. Abraham could not meet their gaze. His own eyes were fixed on the ground as he spoke, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. He did not give a long explanation. He did not speak of Sarah's rage or the mockery at the feast. He only conveyed the crushing finality of the decision. They had to leave. Now. He took a loaf of bread, a pitifully small offering for a lifetime of service, and a son's love and a single skin of water. He placed them on Hagar's shoulder. It was a gesture so meager, so inadequate, that it was almost cruel. It was not the provision of a great lord for his son. It was the charity one might give to a beggar. But perhaps it was all he could bear to give, for to give more would be to prolong the agony of the farewell. He laid a hand on Ishmael's shoulder. The boy, his son, flinched at the touch. For a moment Abraham's composure broke. He pulled the boy into a rough, desperate embrace, burying his face in his son's hair. No words were spoken. What could be said? Forgive me, this is God's will? Any explanation would sound like a hollow excuse for an unforgivable act of betrayal. He was sending his firstborn son, the son he had loved and raised, into the desolate wilderness with nothing but a crust of bread and a bag of water. It was a death sentence. Then he let go. He turned his back on them, unable to watch them walk away. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. As he walked back into the cold stone fortress, the silence that followed him was more deafening than any scream. He had preserved the purity of the line of promise, but he had amputated a part of his own heart to do it. Hagar and Ishmael walked away from the only home they had ever known. They didn't look back. Behind them were the walls of the fortress, representing security, family, and a future that had been stolen from them. Ahead of them lay the Beersheba wilderness, an endless, shimmering expanse of heat, sand and rock. It was a land of vipers and scorpions, a place where the sun was a merciless hammer and life was measured in sips of water. They wandered aimlessly, the sun beating down on them. The world they had known had shrunk to the space between them, a small island of shared misery in an ocean of desolation. The bread was gone by the end of the first day. The water, rationed with desperate care, dwindled with terrifying speed. Ishmael, the strong hunter, was reduced to a stumbling, dehydrated boy. His pride had been scorched away by the relentless sun, his anger replaced by a primal fear. Finally, the last drop of water was gone. The water skin, once a symbol of life, was now a dry, mocking husk. Hagar watched as her son, the boy promised to be the father of a great nation, collapsed under a scrubby desert bush. His body was racked with fever, his lips cracked and bleeding. He was dying. Her own strength gave out. She could not bear to watch the last moments of her son's life, to see the light fade from his eyes. She laid him gently in the shade of the bush and walked away, about the distance of a bowshot. She could not abandon him, but she could not watch him die. She sat down on the hot sand, lifted her face to the empty, brassy sky, and she began to weep. Her stoicism shattered, her grief poured out in a raw, animal wail of despair. "Let me not see the death of my child," she cried out, her voice swallowed by the immense silence of the wilderness. It was in that moment of absolute hopelessness, the same despair she had felt by the spring all those years ago, that the voice came again. "What is the matter, Hagar?" An emissary of God stood before her, his presence a sudden balm in the searing heat. "Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy's cry from where he lies." God had heard the boy. Not her cries of despair, but Ishmael's silent, fading plea for life. "Go," the emissary commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." As he spoke, Hagar's eyes were opened, and she saw it. Not 20 paces from where she sat, hidden in plain sight, was a well. A deep, stone-lined well, shimmering with cool, life-giving water. It had been there all along, but her grief and despair had blinded her to it. A surge of supernatural strength flowed through her. She scrambled to her feet, ran to the well and filled the water skin. She rushed back to Ishmael, pouring the precious liquid onto his parched lips, washing his face, bringing him back from the brink of death. As Ishmael drank, life returned to him. But he was not the same boy who had left the fortress. The softness of youth was gone, burned away by the desert sun and his father's betrayal. In its place was something harder, something forged in the furnace of suffering and abandonment. They did not try to find their way back to civilization. The desert was their home now. God was with them. They lived in the wilderness of Paran, a land of harsh beauty and brutal freedom. Ishmael grew into the man the prophecy had described. He became a master archer, his name whispered with awe and fear among the desert tribes. He was a survivor. His hand, once raised in mockery, was now raised to survive, to hunt, to defend. He and his mother, the outcasts, had become the heart of a new people, a people born of the wilderness, their spirits shaped by the unforgiving landscape. And deep within them, a memory was seared, the memory of exile, of betrayal, and of a promised inheritance given to another. Years bled into decades. The kingdom of the sun-scorched barrens flourished under Isaac, the son of laughter. He was a man of peace, a shepherd and a diplomat who dug wells and nurtured the land. He inherited the covenant, the promise of the valley of living water, and the divine favor of his God. His line, the line of the promise, became the foundation of a people who would be defined by their relationship to this God and this land. They built cities, they codified laws, and they held the story of their miraculous origin as the sacred center of their identity. They were the children of the chosen son. Far away, in the vast and trackless deserts, another kingdom rose, not of stone and mortar, but of wind, sand, and fierce independence. Ishmael, the outcast, became a prince of the wilderness. Just as God had promised, he fathered 12 sons, each one a chieftain of his own powerful tribe. They were the masters of the caravan routes, the warriors of the dunes, their domains stretching across the great peninsula. They were a people forged in hardship, defined by their resilience, their loyalty to kin, and a deep-seated memory of who they were. The children of the firstborn son, Abraham, the great patriarch, eventually died and was laid to rest. And in a rare moment of truce, a flicker of what might have been, his 2 sons came together to bury him. Isaac, the lord of the settled lands, and Ishmael, the lord of the wilderness, stood side by side at their father's grave. For a brief moment, they were not rivals, but simply brothers, united in their shared grief for the man who was the source of both their lives and their division. But after the final stone was rolled into place, they turned and walked away, back to their separate worlds, their separate destinies. The chasm between them remained, and so the story was set in stone, passed down from generation to generation, becoming the bedrock of 2 distinct cultures. On one side, the children of Isaac told the story of a miraculous birth, of a chosen line, and of a sacred, God-given right to a specific piece of land. Their identity was inextricably tied to that promise. They were the inheritors. On the other side, the children of Ishmael told the story of a firstborn son, loved and then betrayed. A story of unjust exile and survival against all odds. They saw themselves as the victims of a broken promise, cheated out of their birthright by the schemes of a jealous woman and a younger favored brother. Their identity was forged in the memory of this grievance. Centuries spun into millennia. The names changed, empires rose and fell, and new religions were built upon these ancient foundations. But the core of the conflict, the echo of that first family tragedy, never faded. It became a ghost that haunted the 2 peoples. The struggle was no longer just about 2 boys in a courtyard. It was about their descendants fighting over the same patch of earth, the valley of living water, the land promised to Abraham. Who was the rightful heir? The son of the promise, or the son of the firstborn? The conflict became a recurring nightmare. The hand of Ishmael's descendants was often raised against the descendants of Isaac, and their hands were raised in return, just as the prophecy foretold. The mockery in the courtyard evolved into geopolitical disputes, theological arguments, and bloody wars. The personal pain of Hagar became the collective grievance of a people. The agonizing choice of Abraham became the justification for drawing hard lines in the sand, both literally and figuratively. Today, when we ask, why the bombs fall, why the hatred seems so intractable, why peace agreements crumble to dust, the answer from this ancient story is devastatingly simple. The conflict we see on our screens is not just about politics, oil, or strategic interests. It is the unending echo of a family feud. It is the ghost of 2 brothers, standing on opposite sides of a promise, each believing with all their heart that they are the true heir. It is the cry of Ishmael, dying of thirst in the wilderness, having been cast out from his home. It is the laughter of Isaac, the sound of a miracle that, for his brother, sounded like the door of his father's house slamming shut forever. The root of this conflict is not in the ground, but in the heart. It is a wound passed down through 4,000 years of history, a story of rejection and chosenness, of grievance and inheritance. And until that ancient wound is acknowledged, until the ghosts of 2 brothers can finally find peace, the world will continue to hear the tragic, unending echo of their rivalry and continue to ask the question, why?